The sun was shining bright over Santa Monica, casting a warm glow through the large glass windows of a small, cozy coffee shop. It wasn't just any coffee shop, it was a place where the smell of fresh beans mixed with the sweet scent of baking muffins. The atmosphere was calm, filled with the quiet noise of people typing on laptops or chatting softly with friends. In the corner of the room, sitting on a simple wooden chair, was a man who the whole world knew. But here, he tried his best to look like anyone else. It was Keanu Reeves. He was wearing a plain jacket, a t-shirt, and a baseball cap that was pulled low over his eyes. He was sipping a black coffee and reading a book. Even though he has starred in huge action movies and is famous across the globe, he sat there without any bodyguards or fuss. He looked like a regular guy enjoying his afternoon. He seemed very peaceful, turning the pages of his book slowly, taking a sip of his drink now and then. However, his quiet moment was about to be interrupted. The front door of the cafe pushed open, and a small bell rang out. Two young boys walked in. They looked like they were around 12 or 13 years old. They were dressed in school clothes, carrying backpacks that looked heavy with books. They didn't walk in with the loud energy that some kids have. Instead, they walked in slowly, looking around the shop with wide eyes. They seemed a little nervous. They walked over to a display case near the counter that was filled with delicious pastries. There were chocolate croissants, donuts covered in sprinkles, and big, soft muffins. The boys stood in front of the glass, staring at the food. One of them pointed at a large chocolate muffin, and the other nodded his head eagerly. They were whispering to each other, leaning in close so nobody else could hear. Keanu lowered his book just a little bit. He watched them over the rim of his coffee cup. He noticed that they weren't just looking at the food, they were counting money. One boy pulled a few crumpled dollar bills out of his pocket. They were old and wrinkled, looking like they had been at the bottom of a backpack for weeks. The other boy pulled out some coins, opening his hand to count them carefully. They counted it once. Then they counted it again. The boy with the bills shook his head, looking worried. He whispered something to his friend, and his friend's face dropped. It was a look of disappointment that everyone recognizes. It was the look of realizing you don't have enough money to buy what you want. They stood there for a moment, looking at the muffins, then looking down at the small amount of money in their hands. They were trying to figure out if they could buy something cheaper, or if they should just leave and forget about the treat. Keanu knew that feeling very well. He hasn't always been a wealthy movie star. He had a tough childhood and didn't have a lot of money growing up. He knew exactly how embarrassing and sad it feels to be at a counter, holding a line up, and realizing you are short on cash. Watching the boys, he didn't see a nuisance, he saw a memory of his own struggles. He saw two kids who just wanted a small moment of happiness but were hitting a wall that feels very high when you are young. The cafe was getting a bit busier. A few people queued up in line behind the boys. An older man in a suit checked his watch, looking impatient. A woman with a phone to her ear sighed loudly. The pressure on the boys was rising. They could feel the eyes of the people behind them. They shifted their weight from one foot to the other, looking very uncomfortable. The boy with the cash took a deep breath, trying to build up the courage to go to the register, even though he knew he probably didn't have enough. Keanu kept watching them. He wasn't staring, but he was paying close attention. The boys decided to go for it. They stepped up to the counter, their voices quiet and shy. The barista, a young woman with a kind smile, asked them what they would like to order. "Can we please have 2 chocolate muffins?" one boy asked. He pointed to the big ones in the display case. And 2 hot chocolates, please. The barista nodded and typed the order into the machine. That will be $12.50, please, she said politely. The silence that followed was heavy. The boys froze. They looked down at the money in the boy's hand again. They had counted it outside, but maybe they thought the price would be lower, or maybe they were just hoping for a miracle. They counted it one last time right there on the counter. $8 and some change. It wasn't enough. They were $4 short. The line behind them grew restless. The man in the suit tapped his foot. The atmosphere in the cafe shifted from calm to tense. The boys turned red. They didn't know what to do. One of them looked at the door, thinking about running out. The other looked at the floor, wishing he could disappear. It was a moment of pure panic and embarrassment. The barista waited, not knowing the situation, but the boys were stuck. Keanu saw all of this happen. He saw the shame on their faces. He saw the people getting annoyed behind them. He knew that if they walked out now, they would remember that feeling of embarrassment for a long time. He decided that he wasn't going to let these kids feel that way. Not today. Not in his cafe. He slowly closed his book and placed it on the table. The movement was calm and deliberate. He stood up, smoothing out his shirt. The people in the cafe didn't really notice him moving. He just looked like a tall customer getting up to leave or maybe throw something in the trash. But Keanu wasn't leaving. He walked toward the counter, cutting through the tension in the room like a knife. He moved with a purpose, but also with a gentleness that made people step back without realizing why. The boy at the counter was just about to tell the barista to cancel the order. He opened his mouth to say never mind, but before he could speak, a hand reached past him. A hand that looked strong and weathered. It was holding a crisp, new $20 bill. The bill landed softly on the counter, right next to the boy's pile of crumpled money. The boys looked up, shocked. They saw the jacket, the cap, and the familiar face. It took them a second to process who was standing next to them. It was the guy from the movies. It was John Wick. It was Neo. But he wasn't fighting anyone right now. He was just standing there with a small, kind smile on his face. He didn't look for attention. He didn't pose for a photo. He just looked at the barista and nodded. "I've got it," Keanu said. His voice was low and soft, barely a whisper, but it cut through the noise of the coffee shop. "And keep the change." The barista's eyes went wide for a second, recognizing him, but she stayed professional. She took the 20 and finished the transaction. The boys just stood there, their mouths open slightly. They couldn't believe what was happening. One second they were about to walk out in shame, and the next second, a movie star was buying their snacks. Keanu didn't make a big scene. He didn't tell them how much he loved their work or ask them what their names were. He just wanted to fix the moment. He looked down at the boys, his eyes showing genuine warmth. He remembered what it was like to be young and hungry. He didn't do it for the cameras or the fame, he did it because it was the right thing to do. The air around the counter changed instantly. The tension vanished, replaced by a feeling of surprise and gratitude. The boys looked at each other, then back at Keanu, huge smiles starting to form on their faces. The sound of the cash register drawer popping open echoed through the quiet shop, signaling that the transaction was complete. The barista placed 2 large chocolate muffins on a plate and handed 2 cups of hot chocolate across the counter. Steam was rising gently from the cups, carrying the rich, sweet smell of cocoa into the air. Just moments ago, the 2 boys were standing there with their heads down, feeling the weight of the world on their shoulders because they didn't have enough money. Now, their eyes were wide with disbelief. They were looking at the food, and then they were looking at the man standing next to them. Keanu didn't make a big deal out of what he had just done. He didn't stand there waiting for applause or for people to start clapping. He didn't even seem to care that everyone in the shop was now staring at him. To him, this wasn't a movie scene, it was just life. He knew that sometimes, people need a little help, and if you are in a position to give that help, you should just do it without making the other person feel small. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking completely relaxed, as if paying for strangers' snacks was the most normal thing in the world. The silence was broken by the barista, who gave a small smile to the boys and told them to enjoy their treats. That snapped the boys out of their daze. They quickly grabbed the muffins and the cups. One of them held the plate carefully, terrified he might drop it, while the other held the hot drinks with both hands. They turned toward Keanu, their faces flushed with a mix of excitement and shyness. They knew who he was. It is impossible to grow up in this generation and not know the face of the star of the Matrix. But seeing him on a big screen and seeing him standing 2 feet away in a coffee shop are two very different things. "Thank you so much," one of the boys stammered. His voice was cracking a little, typical for a boy his age. "Really, thank you." Keanu smiled gently. He leaned in slightly, lowering his head to be on the same eye level as them. It was a small move, but it showed a lot of respect. He didn't talk down to them from a height, he came to their level. He looked them in the eyes and said, "You are very welcome. Enjoy the muffins. They are the best here." The boy who had been counting the crumpled dollars earlier looked down at the money in his hand. He realized he didn't need to give it to the cashier now. He looked back up at Keanu, looking a bit confused about what to do next. He held out the bills, trying to offer them back. "We have some money," he said quietly. "It's not all of it, but..." Keanu reached out and gently pushed the boy's hand back toward his chest. It was a soft gesture, kind and firm at the same time. "Don't worry about it," Keanu said, shaking his head slightly. "Keep it. Save it for something else. Or maybe buy a comic book later today. Just enjoy your afternoon." The boys were stunned. They didn't know what to say. Usually, adults tell kids to save their money or spend it wisely, but here was a stranger telling them to keep their cash and enjoy the treat he just bought them. It was a moment of pure kindness that they definitely weren't expecting. They nodded their heads vigorously, clutching their snacks. Keanu nodded back at them, gave a small, two-finger salute, and turned around to walk back to his table. He didn't linger. He didn't ask to take a selfie with them. He didn't ask for their autographs. He just gave them their space and went back to his own business. This is often how Keanu operates. He understands that when someone famous does something nice, it can sometimes feel overwhelming for the other person. By walking away, he let them have their moment without making them feel like they owed him anything more than a simple thank you. The boys quickly moved away from the counter, searching for a place to sit. The shop was filling up, but they found a small round table near the window, bathed in the California sunlight. They sat down, placing their treasure on the table. They looked like they had just won the lottery. The chocolate muffins looked enormous, and the hot chocolate smelled like heaven. They peeled back the paper on the muffins and took huge bites. For a few minutes, they just ate in silence, enjoying the sugar and the chocolate. However, they couldn't help but keep looking over at the corner of the shop. Keanu was sitting there again, reading his book. He took a sip of his black coffee, completely lost in his own world. It was strange for the boys to see someone so famous acting so ordinary. He wasn't wearing sunglasses inside to hide, he wasn't looking at his phone, he was just reading a paper book. It made him seem real to them, not just like a character on a screen. He seemed like a genuinely good person. While the boys ate, they started whispering again. But this time, the whispering wasn't about stress or money. It was about excitement. They were looking at the extra money they still had in their pockets. They had about $8 left. Before they came in, that money felt like failure because it wasn't enough for the muffins. Now, thanks to Keanu, that money felt like a bonus. It was burning a hole in their pockets. "Okay, what should we do with the money?" one boy asked, wiping a bit of chocolate from his lip. "We still have the whole day." "I don't know," the other one replied, looking down at the bills. "Maybe we can go to the arcade or maybe buy some candy at the store next door. I mean, we can't believe this actually happened." They laughed and joked, their earlier embarrassment completely forgotten. It was amazing how one small act of kindness could change their entire mood. They went from feeling sad and small to feeling lucky and special. They watched Keanu from a distance, wondering if he knew how much this meant to them. They wanted to say thanks again, but they didn't want to bother him. They respected his quiet space. Around the cafe, the other customers were also buzzing with energy. People were whispering to each other, nodding in Keanu's direction. It wasn't just the boys who noticed the interaction, several people at nearby tables had seen the whole thing happen. They saw the look on the boys' faces when they were short on cash, and they saw Keanu step in. There were smiles all around the room. It is rare to see a celebrity do something so humble and private. Often, when famous people do charity, they want cameras there to capture it. But this was different. This was just one human helping another human. A woman sitting at a table near the boys looked over at them and gave them a warm smile. She had seen Keanu pay. The boys smiled back at her, feeling a sense of community. For a moment, the coldness that often exists in a big city melted away. Everyone in that shop shared a little bit of the warmth that Keanu had created. It was a reminder that good things still happen, even in unexpected places. The boys finished their muffins, licking the last crumbs off their fingers. They drank the last drops of their hot chocolate, which was now just lukewarm but still tasted amazing. They gathered their trash and stood up to throw it away. On their way to the trash can, they walked past Keanu's table. They slowed down, feeling nervous again. Keanu must have felt them approach, because he looked up from his book. He didn't look annoyed that they were near his space. He just looked at them with the same calm expression as before. "Thanks again, man," one of the boys whispered. "That was really cool of you." Keanu smiled, a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "No problem, guys," he said softly. "Have a good day." He watched as they walked to the trash can, threw their things away, and headed toward the front door. He could see them high-fiving each other as they reached for the handle. They pushed the door open and walked out into the bright afternoon, back to their lives, but carrying a little bit more joy than they had when they walked in. Keanu watched them for a second, making sure they got out okay, before he turned his eyes back to the pages of his book. The cafe returned to its normal rhythm, the clinking of cups and the humming of the espresso machine filling the air again, but the feeling in the room was lighter now. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky as the afternoon went on, casting long shadows across the floor of the coffee shop. The boys had left, taking their energy and excitement out the door with them. The little bell above the entrance rang one last time as it closed behind them, leaving the shop in a state of quiet reflection. The woman who had been sitting near the window watched them walk down the street, laughing and bumping shoulders with each other. She turned her head back toward the corner where the movie star sat, a thoughtful expression on her face. Inside the cafe, the mood had shifted completely. The earlier tension, the impatience of the man in the suit, the annoyed sighing from the line had evaporated. It was as if Keanu's small act of kindness had acted like a drop of dye in a glass of water, spreading out and changing the color of the whole room. People were smiling at each other more. The barista was humming a tune while she wiped down the counter. Even the man who had been checking his watch earlier seemed relaxed, slowly sipping his coffee and reading a newspaper instead of tapping his foot impatiently. Keanu was back in his own world, or so it seemed. He had returned to his book, his eyes scanning the lines of text. But if anyone looked closely, they would see that he hadn't turned a page in quite a while. He was sitting still, staring at the paper, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. He was thinking about the interaction. It wasn't that he was seeking praise or glory, those things didn't motivate him. It was just that moments like that stuck with him. He knew that life was made up of these tiny, fleeting seconds that could either break someone's spirit or lift it up. Today, he was glad he could be the one to lift it up. He took a sip of his coffee, which had gone cold. He didn't mind the cold coffee. It was just fuel for the day. He placed the cup back on the saucer with a soft clink. He was wearing a jacket that looked well worn, comfortable rather than fashionable. It was the kind of jacket you wear because you like it, not because a stylist told you to wear it. Everything about him screamed that he was at peace with himself, which is a rare thing to find in a person who has so much fame and fortune. While Keanu sat in the corner, the conversations in the shop started to turn toward him. People speak in hushed tones when they recognize a celebrity, a mixture of curiosity and respect. A couple at a nearby table was whispering. "That was really nice of him," the young man said to his partner. "I didn't think guys like him did stuff like that in real life." "It wasn't about the money," his partner replied, shaking her head slightly. "Did you see the way he looked at them? It wasn't like he was a fan meeting a celebrity. He looked at them like, I don't know, like a big brother or something. He didn't make them feel small." They were right. The true power of what happened wasn't the $20 bill. Anybody in that shop could have covered the cost of 2 muffins. Many people had $20 in their pockets. But the difference was in the delivery. Keanu hadn't made a show of it. He hadn't made the boys feel like charity cases. He had stepped in, solved the problem, and stepped back out. He preserved their dignity. That is a much harder gift to give than money. It requires empathy and a deep understanding of what it feels like to be vulnerable. Keanu shifted in his chair, stretching his long legs. He caught the eye of the couple who had been whispering. He didn't glare or look away. He just gave a small, polite nod and a tight-lipped smile. It was his way of acknowledging them without inviting a conversation. He valued his privacy, but he wasn't rude about it. He understood that being famous meant people would talk about him, and he accepted it as part of the deal. The barista, who had been watching the interaction with a smile, decided to top off Keanu's coffee. She walked over to his table with the pot. He looked up, surprised, and gave her a nod of thanks. "Those kids were pretty happy," she said softly, keeping her voice low so the other customers wouldn't hear. "They were," Keanu replied. His voice was raspy but warm. "Just needed a little break, I think." The barista paused for a second, wanting to say more but respecting his boundary. She had worked here for a while and had seen him come in many times. He was always polite, always tipped well, and never demanded special treatment. It was refreshing for her to work in a place where the owner wasn't full of himself. Well, it was a cool thing to see, she said simply, and walked back to the counter. Keanu watched her go, then looked out the window. The street outside was busy. Cars were driving by, people were rushing to appointments, and the city was moving at its usual fast pace. Inside the cafe, it felt like a sanctuary. It was a bubble where time moved a little slower. He thought about his own life. He had been in the spotlight for decades. He had seen the highest highs of success and the lowest lows of tragedy. He had lost people he loved deeply. Through all of that, he learned that money and fame are temporary. They can vanish in an instant. But the way you treat people, that lasts. The memory of a kindness stays with you. He remembered times when he was young and didn't know where his next meal was coming from. He remembered the kindness of strangers who helped him when he was struggling. Those moments were burned into his memory. In a way, buying those muffins was his way of paying back the universe for the help he received when he was a nobody. It was a cycle. Someone helps you, so you help someone else. It keeps the world spinning in the right direction. The door opened again, and a group of loud tourists walked in, bringing a burst of energy and noise with them. They were carrying cameras and maps, looking around excitedly. They spotted Keanu immediately. The whispers started flying. Is that him? Yes, that's definitely him. The atmosphere shifted from peaceful to electric. Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't grab his things and run out the back door, even though he probably could have. He knew that if he left now, it might cause a scene. Instead, he stayed put. He put his head down, focusing on his book, trying to give the impression that he was just deeply engrossed in the story. He was a master of blending in, even when he was the only thing people were looking at. The group of tourists debated whether to approach him. They stood near the counter, pointing and whispering. Most of them were respectful, just excited to see a movie star in real life. They didn't want to bother him too much, but the temptation was strong. They took a few photos from a distance, trying to be sneaky, using their phones like long-range cameras. Keanu was aware of it all. He felt the eyes on him. He heard the shutter sounds of the phones. But he chose to ignore it. To react would only encourage them. To get angry would ruin the vibe. To sit quietly and read was the best defense he had. The barista stepped in, acting as a shield without even being asked. She engaged the tourists in conversation about the menu, distracting them with questions about what kind of pastries they liked. She guided their attention away from the corner table and toward the display case. It was a subtle move, but Keanu noticed. He appreciated it. It was another small act of kindness in a chain of them that day. He sat there for another 20 minutes, finishing his cold coffee and reading a few more chapters. The tourists eventually got their drinks and left, chattering excitedly about how they saw the guy from The Matrix. The shop began to empty out as the afternoon turned into early evening. The light coming through the windows changed from bright white to a golden orange. Keanu finally closed his book. He marked his page with a bookmark he had pulled out of his pocket. He stood up, slipping the book into his bag. He straightened his jacket and adjusted his cap. He walked over to the counter to leave his cup. The barista was there, wiping down the surface again. "Leaving so soon?" she asked with a smile. "Time to get back to work," Keanu said. "Thanks for the coffee." "No problem. Have a good one." He walked toward the door, his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed. As he pushed the door open, he didn't look back. He didn't seek validation from the room. He just walked out into the street, disappearing into the flow of people walking down the sidewalk. The bell rang above the door, and then silence settled back over the coffee shop. Inside, the customers who were left looked at the empty table where he had been sitting. It was just a table. An empty coffee cup. A chair pushed back. But the feeling he left behind was heavy with meaning. Everyone in that shop that afternoon walked out feeling a little bit lighter, a little bit happier, and a little bit more inspired to be kind. It wasn't a movie. It wasn't a script. It was just real life, happening in real time, showing everyone that sometimes, the biggest heroes don't wear capes, they just buy a couple of muffins for kids who need a boost. Outside the coffee shop, the afternoon air was cooling down. The streets of Santa Monica were busy, filled with the noise of traffic and people rushing to get home after work. But for the two boys, the world felt different now. They walked down the sidewalk, no longer dragging their feet. Their backpacks felt lighter, even though nothing inside them had changed. The mood between them had shifted completely from when they first walked into the cafe. Earlier, there was stress and worry. Now, there was a buzz of electric excitement. They found a bench a little way down the street, under a tree that provided some shade from the setting sun. They sat down, not because they were tired, but because they needed a moment to process what had just happened. They placed their backpacks on the ground between their feet. The boy who had been holding the extra money, the $8 that Keanu had told him to keep, pulled the crumpled bills out of his pocket. He smoothed them out on his knee, staring at them as if they were foreign objects. "I still can't believe that happened," the other boy said, leaning back against the bench and looking up at the leaves. "I thought we were going to get kicked out." "That man in the suit looked so angry." "I know," the first boy replied, still looking at the money. "And then, he just stepped in. He didn't even hesitate. It was so fast." They sat there for a while, letting the reality sink in. It wasn't just about the muffins or the hot chocolate, although those were delicious. It was about how they felt in that moment. When they realized they didn't have enough money, they felt small. They felt like everyone was looking at them, judging them. In that split second, they felt like they didn't belong in that nice shop. But Keanu changed that narrative instantly. He didn't make them feel like charity cases. He made them feel like they deserved a treat just as much as anyone else. He made them feel seen. "You think he does that all the time?" the boy asked, turning to his friend. "Maybe," his friend shrugged. "He didn't act like it was a big deal. It seemed like he does nice things for people every day." They thought about his attitude. He wasn't looking for a thank you. He didn't stand there waiting for them to scream his name. He just paid, smiled that quiet smile, and walked away. It was a lesson in humility for the boys. They realized that true kindness doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need a camera recording it. It just needs someone who is willing to help without expecting anything in return. This was a very different lesson than the ones they usually saw on TV or in video games, where people often did good things only to get a reward or become famous. The boy with the money folded the bills carefully and put them back in his pocket. He felt a surge of responsibility. This wasn't just money anymore, it was a gift. It was a second chance given to them by a stranger. "So, what are we going to do with it?" the friend asked, nodding toward the pocket. "He said to save it or buy a comic book." The boy thought for a moment. He looked around the street. There was a convenience store on the corner. They could easily go in there and buy candy bars or sodas. That would be the fun thing to do. They were kids, after all. But as he sat there, he remembered the look on Keanu's face. He remembered the actor telling them to enjoy their afternoon and to save it for something else. The money felt heavy in his pocket, but in a good way. It felt like an opportunity. "Let's not spend it on candy," the boy said finally. "Let's go to the comic book store. There's that shop a few blocks down. I've been wanting to read this new issue for weeks, but I never have enough money." His friend's eyes lit up. "That sounds awesome. Let's go." They grabbed their backpacks and stood up. They walked with a new purpose. They weren't just wandering around killing time anymore. They were on a mission. As they walked, they talked about other things: school, video games, homework, but the conversation kept circling back to the cafe. It was the kind of story they knew they would tell for the rest of their lives. One day, when they were old men, they would be able to say, "You know, one time Keanu Reeves bought me a muffin." When they reached the comic book store, the little bell above the door rang, just like at the coffee shop. The store was quiet and smelled like old paper and ink. It was a place filled with adventures. The walls were lined with colorful covers featuring superheroes and villains. The boys walked in, feeling a sense of respect for the place. They didn't run or shout. They walked slowly, looking at the racks. They found the new issue the boy had wanted. It was shiny and bright. It cost $5. He took it to the counter, where the owner, an older man with glasses, was reading a newspaper. The boy placed the comic book and the $8 on the counter. The owner looked up, surprised. He counted the money and looked at the boy. "Keep the change?" he asked, teasing a little bit because the boy had given him exact change plus a few extra quarters he had found in his other pocket. "No, just the comic, please," the boy said with a smile. As the owner rang up the sale, the boy's eyes wandered to a small display on the counter. It was a jar with a piece of tape on it that read "Animal Shelter Donations." There were a few dollar bills and some coins inside. The boys looked at the jar, then at each other. They both had the same thought at the exact same time. It was like a spark passed between them. "Wait," the boy said, stopping the owner as he reached for the money. He took $3 back from the pile. "Put this in the jar." The owner looked at him, raising his eyebrows. "You sure, kid, that's your money?" "Yeah," the boy nodded. "We had a really good day. Someone was nice to us. We want to pass it on." The owner broke into a wide, genuine smile. He took the $3 and dropped them into the plastic jar. The coins clinked against the glass, a satisfying sound. He handed the comic book to the boy. "That is a very cool thing to do. You boys have a good evening." "We will," they said together. They walked out of the store, the comic book safely in a backpack. They felt 10 feet tall. Buying the comic was fun, but putting that money in the jar felt even better. It felt like they had completed a circle. Keanu had done something nice for them, and now they had done something nice for someone else, even if it was just a small donation for animals they had never met. They understood now that kindness was contagious. It spreads from one person to another, growing a little bit each time. As the sun finally set and the street lights flickered on, the boys headed toward the bus stop. They had to go home. They had to face homework and chores and the normal routine of life. But today was different. Today, they had witnessed something good. Waiting for the bus, they stood close together, watching the cars go by. The city noise was loud, horns honking in the distance, but they felt a sense of peace inside. They realized that the world could be a tough place. People could be impatient and rude, like the man in the suit. But there were also people like Keanu. People who looked out for others. People who used what they had to make someone else's day a little brighter. The bus pulled up, its doors folding open with a loud hiss. They climbed on, digging into their pockets for their bus passes. They found seats near the back, away from the crowd. As the bus lurched forward, merging back into the flow of traffic, the boys looked out the dark windows. They watched the lights of the city blur by. They were tired, but it was a good kind of tired. "Hey," one boy said to the other, just before they got off at their stop. "You think we'll ever see him again?" "Maybe," the other replied. "But even if we don't, I'm never going to forget it." They got off the bus and walked the few blocks to their neighborhood. The street lights cast long shadows on the pavement. They waved goodbye to each other at the corner, promising to meet up tomorrow to read the comic book. As they walked into their respective houses, smelling dinner cooking and hearing the sounds of their families, they carried a secret warmth in their hearts. They knew that tomorrow they would go back to school, and the world would be normal again. But they also knew that they now held the power to change someone's day, just like Keanu had changed theirs. And that was a superpower better than anything you could find in a comic book. The city lights of Santa Monica began to twinkle as the deep blue of the evening sky took over. The coffee shop was starting to wind down for the day. The morning rush was long gone, and the lunch crowd had dispersed. Now, the cafe was filled with the warm, golden glow of the hanging lamps. It was that time of the evening when the espresso machine wasn't roaring as loudly, and the music playing overhead seemed a bit softer, more relaxed. The staff was beginning the closing duties, wiping down tables and sweeping the floors, but there was still a gentle hum of conversation in the air. Even though Keanu Reeves had left the building quite some time ago, his presence was still felt. It was a strange thing, a sort of invisible energy that lingered in the room. The customers who were currently sitting there hadn't seen what happened with the boys, but the staff knew. The barista who had rung up the order kept replaying the moment in her mind. She had worked in the service industry for a long time. She had seen plenty of celebrities come and go. Some were polite, some were demanding, and some pretended she didn't exist. But this interaction was different. She walked over to the table where Keanu had been sitting. It was empty now, just the wooden chair pushed back slightly. On the table, there was no tip left on a napkin, because he had taken care of the bill at the counter earlier. She picked up his empty coffee cup. It was a simple white ceramic cup with a chip on the rim. It looked like every other cup in the shop, yet it felt significant. She paused for a moment, looking at the spot where he sat. It wasn't about the fame. It wasn't about the action movies. It was about how he made the people around him feel. He made the staff feel valued, and he made those boys feel seen. That, she thought to herself, is what real class looks like. The story of the incident began to spread slowly, not through the internet or social media, but through the old-fashioned way, word of mouth. The man in the suit, who had been impatient earlier, was still sitting at a nearby table. He had witnessed the whole thing. Initially, he had been annoyed at the delay. He had important meetings and emails to answer, and 2 kids counting pennies was not how he wanted to spend his afternoon. But watching Keanu step in had made him rethink his own attitude. He watched the boys leave with such joy, and then watched the actor return to his book without asking for credit. Later, when the man went to pay his own bill, he did something uncharacteristic for him. He told the barista to add an extra $20 to the total, to cover the coffee of the next person who came in. Inspired by the earlier show, he said with a sheepish smile. The barista was taken aback but grateful. It was a ripple effect. One act of kindness had inspired another, and then another. It was proof that negativity is loud, but positivity is sticky. It tends to hang around and change the atmosphere long after the initial moment is over. Outside, the city was moving into night mode. Buses were rumbling down the streets, and headlights swept across the pavement. In a small apartment a few miles away, the two boys were settling in. They had finished their dinners, done their chores, and were now getting ready for bed. They were young boys, so usually, they would be arguing about which video game to play or who got control of the TV remote. But tonight was quieter. One of the boys lay on his bed, looking up at the ceiling. He thought about the day. He thought about the feeling of the embarrassment at the counter, the heat in his cheeks, and the sinking feeling in his stomach when he realized he didn't have enough money. Then, he thought about the relief that washed over him when the bill was paid. He realized that the money wasn't the most important part. The most important part was that a stranger, someone who didn't know their names or their stories, decided to care. He decided to step into their situation and make it better. He got out of bed and walked over to his backpack. He unzipped the main pocket and pulled out the comic book they had bought earlier. He opened it, looking at the colorful pages. The heroes in the comic had amazing powers. They could fly, shoot lasers from their eyes, and lift cars with one hand. But as he looked at the pictures, he thought that in real life, you don't need superpowers to be a hero. You just need to be aware. You just need to look up from your own life and see if someone around you is struggling. Keanu didn't use any martial arts today. He didn't dodge bullets. He just used $20 and a kind smile. And that was enough to save the day. He closed the comic book and put it on his nightstand. He made a silent promise to himself that he would try to be like that when he grew up. It was easy to be kind when you have a lot of money, sure, but he hoped he would remember the feeling of being the kid who needed help. He hoped he would always treat people with dignity, no matter who they were. Back at the coffee shop, the last customers were leaving. The barista turned the sign on the door from open to closed. She flipped the lock with a click, shutting out the noise of the street. The shop was now quiet. The air smelled of spilled coffee and cleaning spray. She walked around, turning off the lamps one by one. As the room grew darker, the peaceful feeling remained. She thought about how much the world talks about Keanu Reeves. They talk about his movies, his sad past, his internet memes. People call him the internet's boyfriend or the nicest guy in Hollywood. Sometimes those labels can feel heavy or fake. But today, seeing him interact with those boys, she realized that the rumors were true. He wasn't putting on a show. He wasn't performing a good deed for an audience. He was just a man having a coffee who saw an opportunity to help. It is rare to see someone with that much power and fame handle it with such grace. Often, money and fame can make people feel entitled, like they are above the rest of the world. They build walls around themselves. But Keanu didn't have walls. He was accessible. He was human. He stood in line like everyone else. He read a book in the corner. And he noticed two struggling kids. She finished wiping the last table and walked to the back to hang up her apron. She grabbed her bag and headed for the back exit. It was dark in the alleyway, but the lights of the city provided a comforting glow. As she walked to her car, she pulled out her phone. She didn't post about it on social media. She didn't take a picture of the empty table or tell the world a secret. She just sent a text to her mom. She wrote, "You won't believe the sweet thing that happened at work today." She got into her car and started the engine. She felt good about her shift. It wasn't a particularly busy day, and the tips might not have been record-breaking, but she felt fulfilled. She had witnessed a moment of genuine human connection. In a world that often feels divided and angry, where people are quick to judge and slow to help, today was a reminder that goodness exists. It exists in the quiet moments, in the coffee shops, in the whispers between friends. The story didn't end there, of course. The boys would grow up. Keanu would go on to make more movies. The coffee shop would serve thousands more cups of coffee, but the impact of those few minutes would ripple outward. The boys might tell their friends, who might tell their parents. The man in the suit might pay for someone else's coffee tomorrow. The barista might treat the next customer she sees with a little extra patience. We often think that changing the world requires a grand gesture, a massive donation, a protest, a new law. But stories like this remind us that changing the world happens in small steps. It happens one interaction at a time. It happens when we choose empathy over annoyance. It happens when we choose to see the human being in front of us instead of just an obstacle in our day. As the city fell asleep, the stars hidden by the glow of the streetlights, the memory of the afternoon remained. A simple act of kindness. 2 boys. A movie star. And a quiet cafe in Santa Monica. It wasn't a blockbuster movie ending. There were no explosions, no slow-motion scenes, no epic speeches. Just a door closing, a thank you, and a smile. And sometimes, that is the most powerful ending of all. Because it's real. It's life. And it shows us that no matter who we are, we all have the power to make someone's day a little brighter.